welcome to everybody to the first in a new series of Anatolian Studies virtual seminars. My name is Nisha McSweeney. I am the academic editor of the journal Anatolian Studies. And today we are launching the 2022 volume of the journal with the first paper, which is going to be spoken to you, or not published, but spoken to you. They're all going to be published together, but they will be given to you as a seminar. So it's a little bit of a sneak preview. None of you have had the chance to read this paper yet, but I hope it will whet your appetite for when the publication, the print version, does come out. I would encourage you all, as we are waiting for another few minutes or so, if you are not already members of the British Institute at Ankara, I would encourage you to think about membership. Come and join our very special club. You will get not only Richard's fantastic paper from tonight, but the entirety of the seminar series will be delivered to your door in the form of the 2022 journal edition of the journal. So please do think about joining the Institute if you haven't done already. Hello as well, we've got David in Wales, Mazen in Lebanon, Lilith in Yerevan, Shirin in Istanbul, Luai in Istanbul as well. Lots of people in Istanbul, Salma in Istanbul, Drake is in Cape Town, Maria in Thessaloniki. Hello to you all, and lovely that you're all here. I think we are getting close to the academic 5 minutes past the hour. So I think that is almost enough from me for the time being. Just a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. We will have a paper which will last 35 or 40 minutes. During the course of this paper, we still really love to hear from you in the chat box. Please keep the chat coming in and feel free to talk to each other. We like the idea of Anatolian Studies being a community as well as a journal. But if you have burning questions, academic questions about the content of the paper that you would like to ask Richard, please don't put those in the chat because we won't see them properly. Please put them in the Q&A box that is in the bottom of your screen, should be in the black ribbon at the bottom of your screens. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and that way we'll be able to address them directly, and you'll get to ask Richard all the things that you could ever possibly want to know. And welcome to everyone who is also watching on YouTube live streaming. If you type in your questions, they will magically, thanks to the hard work of Charlotte Jordan, come across to us here in the Zoom room. Right, without further ado, I'm now going to hand over this seminar to Dr. Anna Koller, who's a lecturer in Roman archaeology at the University of Southampton, and who will be your chair.
Thank you, Nish. Hi, everybody. I can't believe how global this is. This is just awesome. I'm so excited that there are people from all over the world. It's just fantastic. It's also my first time hosting one of these meetings, so do forgive me if I manage to press the wrong button or do something stupid. I will endeavour to ask your questions to our speaker once the lecture itself is finished. So yeah, as Nish says, pop them in the Q&A box and then I can read them out for you. But with no further ado, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Dr. Richard McClary, who is the senior lecturer in Islamic art and architecture at the University of York. And he's going to give us a paper tonight entitled Geometric Interlace, Stereotomic Strapwork in the Architecture of Rum Seljuq Anatolia. And I'm very much looking forward to it. Richard, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much. You'll have to bear with me for a second while I do my Luddite interpretation here and try and share my screen. I think I'll have to do it twice, but there is a method to the madness. Right. Now I'm going to try that one more time because this will be the first time, and it should now, the magic of technology, be visible. Okay, can everyone see that?
That's perfect.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks so much, Nisha, and indeed everyone else who's here for joining me. It's a great honor to be invited to speak to you all this evening. And I'll start by saying that the research for this talk was made possible in part by the generous award of a research grant from the British Institute at Ankara. This funding allowed me to survey several of the buildings in question in September 2020 and to acquire a number of relevant and very hard to find Turkish publications. I'd also like to credit Scott Redford with having helped develop elements of this paper when we were together in Cairo a few years ago. I have to say that as the research director for the British Institute of Persian Studies, we can learn something from you at the BIAA. You funded my research trip. In return, I've written a short piece for your magazine, Heritage Turkey. Now I'm giving this lecture, and the resulting publication, as Nisha said, will be in the next issue of Anatolian Studies. If only it always worked so smoothly. On to the Seljuks. I'll give some basic background information and dates throughout my talk. So apologies to those of you who are familiar with such material, but hopefully for some others of you, it will be useful. This paper examines the introduction of stereotomic ablaq, or black and white, marble geometric interlace into the architecture of Rum Seljuq Anatolia in the early 13th century. I'll give an overview of the subsequent developments and changes to the constituent motifs in the following decades before its eventual decline. Attention starts with the Zangid and Ayyubid origins of the technique in the mihrabs of several madrasas or religious schools in Aleppo, and moves on to examine the ways in which the pattern mutated and the style of execution shifted over time. A distinctively Anatolian architectural motif emerged throughout the course of the 13th century, primarily on monuments built in and around Konya. The possible meanings encoded within the geometric forms and how they changed over time will be examined, as will the uses of dragon-like forms. A related figural secular example in Iraq will also be studied, so as to demonstrate the overt use of this same symbolism. I'll conclude with an examination of the later uses of related forms that look similar, but do not appear to be encoded with the same semiotic meanings. Ultimately, it will be seen that it was the motifs first developed in Aleppo in the 12th century, rather than the techniques that were more widely used in Anatolia in the 13th century. Next slide. Yes. So this is a bit of a guide to the region, but although it does have this sort of border in red, it's important to remember that in reality there were border zones, liminal zones between different political entities, not the hard, rigid, defined borders that separate political entities today. Here, if you can see my cursor, hopefully you can, here's Konya. We're going to look at something in Akşa here, near Aksaray, and Aleppo is down here. And I'm going to go to Al Ahmadiyya, way over here, which is just northeast of Mosul here. So these are the main sites that we'll be looking at today. The motif can be found on the mihrabs. These are the prayer niches of several madrasas in Aleppo, with the locations of the known examples shown on this map, courtesy of the US Army Map Service. You do have their uses after all, it seems. While the decorative elements under discussion are only one part of much larger and more complex structures, the focus here today is specifically on this one particular type of motif. So they are decontextualized. So I don't like doing that, but time being what it is, we'll have to focus on this one element. The late 12th and early 13th century stereotomic marble interlace compositions found on a number of mihrabs in Aleppo are generally somewhat more complex than the ones produced in Anatolia. However, they are clearly the source of both the technique and the aesthetic, and there are several examples that are very closely related. The overall composition appears to be an original innovation of the hard stone masons in Aleppo, but elements of the circular interlace motif can be seen to derive from the very long tradition of Roman and Byzantine pavements, often as part of a quincunx, 4 circles in the corners and 1 in the middle pattern. There are a number of related patterns on the pavement of the 12th century Pantokrator monastery in Istanbul, also on the floor of the Hagia Sophia in Iznik, formerly Nicaea, which is shown here on the right, and an earlier 8th century example of the pattern in mosaic on the floor of the Church of the Virgin in Madaba in Jordan, laid in 767, and that's seen here on the left. The courtyard Iwan, this vaulted space open at one end of the Mashhad al-Hussein, located 2.5 kilometers west of the Aleppo citadel, dated to 579 AH, so that's in the Muslim calendar, corresponds to 1183 in the modern calendar that we use here in the West mostly, is thought to be the earliest example of this sort of stereotomic strapwork. An inscription panel that was at the back of the Iwan, it's just this one here, gave the date and specified that the patron was a silk merchant named Abul Ghanaim ibn Abil Fadl Yahya, but there's no craftsman named. As it is external and closer in scale to the later portals in Konya than the mihrabs in Aleppo, it is a relevant structure to examine. The portal was destroyed in an explosion in 1920 and then rebuilt in quite a different way, which is why these historical photos are so important. This photograph by K.A.C. Cresswell is one of the few records of it in its original state. And as you can see here, a disaster waiting to happen, the offending ammunition crates are stacked in the Iwan. However, the Mashhad al-Hussein portal is not ablaq, and like the version of the motif located to the right of the Al-Adin Mosque portal in Konya that we'll look at shortly, it relied on low relief instead of tonal contrast to make the pattern stand out. Perhaps more significantly, the Iwan portal of the Mashhad al-Hussein does not have the semicircular interlace on the face of the arch, that's this bit here, also called the extrados, and thus does not represent the complete semiotic sign that the later Aleppine mihrabs and the portals in Konya do. In addition to the structural evidence, the architect whose signature is associated with the north portal of the Al-Adin Mosque in Konya has a Syrian nisba, or attribution, that is al-Dimashqi, albeit suggesting a Damascene or Damascus origin rather than from Aleppo. While a nisba in and of itself is not proof of a craftsman's origin or place of training, it can provide useful secondary evidence when the stylistic elements suggest strong links with a certain region or city. The Al-Sultaniya madrasa, just south of the citadel in Aleppo, was under construction for a number of years, with a completion date of 620 AH, so 1223. Its mihrab has a magnificent, well, I say has, unfortunately the building's mostly destroyed now. This was photographed when I was there in 2009, but it does have this magnificent strapwork interlace composition that is closely related to, but somewhat more complex than, the ones on the two portals in Konya that we'll look at shortly, as well as being a little smaller in scale. Additional elements include a horizontal band that cuts through the central circle at the apex of the arch, that's this here, and the use of 3 colors instead of 2 for the corner strapwork interlace, this section here. Although the recess of the arched hood is different, with these continuous bands reminiscent of earlier stonework from the Fatimid period, has been the dynasty that ruled much of North Africa from Cairo between 909 and 1171. The Aleppine source of the motif is clear, and for a significant portion of the 13th century, the constituent elements of the design were absorbed into the decorative vocabulary of the Anatolian relief-carved limestone tradition. While larger than the earlier Aleppine examples, both of the ablaq interlace strapwork patterns in Konya are somewhat simpler in terms of design. They're predominantly bi rather than trichrome, and they lack the additional horizontal band that intersects with the central circular motif at the apex. This section here doesn't have that. Apart from the 2 portals in Konya and the flanking niches at the Sultan Han Aksaray, which we'll come to shortly, the rest of the examples of architectural interlace are either not marble or not stereotomic, instead being executed in monochrome relief. The section of stereotomic strapwork interlace over the north portal of the Al-Adin Mosque, which is on the north end of the citadel in the center of Konya, is well known and published, including by Leutved in 1907 and more recently Scott Redford in 1991, but it remains something of an enigma with regard to the meaning of its decoration. Despite its initial appearance, it is not strictly bichrome, as though these small pie slice shaped yellow stone inserts between the overlapping semicircular pattern on the extrados of the arch, making it technically a 3-color composition. And the 8-point star section in the recess arch below that you see here also has small yellow stone inserts set into the predominantly grey and white marble pattern in a similar manner to the section you see above. This is somewhat reminiscent of the more conspicuous use of large sections of yellow marble alongside black and white that we just saw in the mihrab of the Al-Sultaniya madrasa in Aleppo. An inscription panel next to the portal bears the name of the Syrian craftsman responsible for it, Mohammed ibn Khawlan al-Dimashqi, and the location of the portal, partway up the Citadel Hill, made it a highly visible architectural motif, forming part of the main royal complex of mosque, tomb tower, and palace. The ablaq, so this two-tone marble composition over the portal, is not the only example of geometric strapwork interlace on the north wall of the mosque. There is another contemporaneous section just a few meters to the right, shown here, forming a trilobed arch around an inscription panel. The text, including the date 1219 and the name of the Seljuk Sultan Izz-ad-Din Kaykaus, who ruled from 1211 to 1220, has been published by Scott Redford. The fact that the sophisticated stereotomic ablaq marble version and the rougher monochrome intaglio limestone variant were used at the same time suggests the craftsmen were drawing on the mihrabs and the earlier Mashhad al-Hussein in Aleppo, while looking for techniques as well as motifs. This also helps explain why the arch does not have the interconnected overlapping semicircles on this section here, as are seen on the portal next to it. Given the technical difficulties in carving and fitting the complex marble blocks together, it is perhaps not surprising that it was the far easier to execute low relief carving of the pattern into a monochrome limestone surface that became the dominant technique for the depiction of strapwork interlace over the following decades in Anatolia. The design features a number of inconsistencies, especially in this upper left corner, but it's unclear how much of this is the result of later restoration. There is one other portal with stereotomic ablaq strapwork interlace in Konya, and it now forms the main access to the Büyük Karate Madrasa in Konya, dated itself to 649 AH, so 1251 to 2, but was most likely built around the same time as the nearby Al-Adin Mosque portal, to which it is strikingly similar, and then subsequently was incorporated into the later structure. Several scholars have suggested that the portal should be dated to 1219 to 20, like the other one, rather than the later date given in the inscription at the top along here, which has clearly been altered. Despite this overall similarity, however, there are a number of significant differences. Apart from the large scale, the use of these muqarnas here, which is a multiple modular vaulting unit, very typical in Islamic architecture, over the doorway, and 3 high relief azure bosses, one here, and another mirroring it on the other side. The main differences that are relevant to the discussion today concern the variations in the strapwork itself. There are 2 main points of variance, the most obvious being in the sections of strapwork that curve over the top of the semicircular interlace on the arch extrados, so that's this section here and here. They follow the same curve on the Al-Adin Mosque portal, seen here on the right, but fail to do so on the Karate portal, giving it a slightly more awkward and seemingly less well-designed feel, even though some other elements are somewhat more crisply executed. The second point of difference is the space between the lower inner portions of strapwork and the first grey band of decoration. The 2 almost touch here on this Karate portal, but there's a space equivalent to the width of the strapwork built into the design on the one on the Al-Adin Mosque. As a result, this latter design has more room to breathe and is less compressed into the space. Just to give a relative sense of the location of these, and indeed the other structures in Konya that we'll return to later, here's a Google Earth image with the relevant structures highlighted. So you have the portal on the mosque here, this is the mosque itself, and there is the Büyük Karate Madrasa there. Then we also have the Ince Minare and the Sahibata down here, and this is the main citadel hill in the center of the city. The 2 portals there were clearly in a dialogue, the north end. They can both be seen from each other's location. Following the construction of these two closely related portals in Konya, both of which appear to date from the same period, the next example of the use of the spandrel pattern, if not the arch-extrados interlace, is on a secular but still sultanic structure to the east of Konya. The Sultan Han Aksaray caravanserai features flanking niches located at right angles to and either side of the main external entrance. Just here, with another one just out of sight on that wall. This building is the largest of the surviving caravanserais of the period and is located 45 kilometers west of Aksaray on the road to Konya. The building was designed by the same Mohammed ibn Khawlan al-Dimashqi as the mosque portal in Konya, and each niche has two sections of bichrome marble patterns, the upper section and then the arch section. The upper section has strapwork interlace that is a significantly smaller version of the compositions we just saw in Konya, along with the lower section with these bell-shaped joggled voussoirs, that's a sort of wobbly edge of voussoirs, this section of an arch. The black ones have the point facing up, the white ones, alternate ones, have it facing down. And both compositions act like a miniature portals and clearly reference the portals accessing what is the primary, or it certainly was, the primary architectural complex of the whole Rum Seljuq lands on the citadel in Konya. Although the completion date of this building isn't known, construction was started in 626, so 1229. This is during the reign of the next Seljuk Sultan, Ala ad-Din Kayqubad, who ruled from 1220 to 1237. While the voussoirs are truly stereotomic, the strapwork interlace in the spandrels is in a technique more like stone mosaic, with the inlay formed of pieces of grey marble that are recessed as deep as the bands are wide on the visible face, and you can see how far set in they are. There are several minor but not insignificant variations between the two niches. There's a difference from one side to the other on the spandrels of the right-hand niche, not major, but it is there. This is slightly lower than this one, and it's even more marked on the one opposite. The same differences are more pronounced on the opposite side, and these differences, while minor, are indicative of a more free-form and slightly less rigid approach to the production of what are seemingly identical symmetrical decorative inlay and stereotomic decoration on the part of the craftsman responsible than might initially appear to be the case. And there are a number of variations across these decorative elements of the two niches in terms of both design and execution. The recent restoration, started after 2012, has unfortunately resulted in some appallingly bad damage, including roughly smeared cement over the lower portion of the right-hand spandrel on the entrance to the right of the entrance, and mismatched black used for the replaced voussoirs and section of the spandrel decoration, and you can see some of that just here. The Sultan Han Aksaray examples are closer in scale to the antecedent Aleppine mihrabs than they are to the portals in Konya, and almost all of them feature pseudo-Corinthian capitals. So that's the Aleppine mihrabs and these ones here, but not the ones in Konya. They have these pseudo-Corinthian capitals, as well as a variety of types of fluted engaged columns and the stereotomic ablaq marble pattern in the spandrels. So there are variations in terms of scale, but a number of formal similarities across time and space. Like the two earlier portals in Konya, but unlike the later relief monochrome examples we'll come to, the spandrels of these two niches retain the more clearly legible encoded names of Allah, Muhammad, and Ahli, and this is a topic to which I will now begin to address. There are two main elements to the compositions seen on the initial examples in Konya, as well as the mihrabs in Aleppo. These are the interlaced semicircular pattern on the face of the arch and the largely rectilinear pattern with some curvilinear elements in the spandrels. The two elements are interconnected and have been argued to be abstracted representations of the twin dragons seen on numerous city gates in the wider region, often with a dragon slayer figure in each spandrel. Although the closest direct parallels for the interlace patterns in Anatolia are to be found in the architecture of Aleppo, there are several monumental examples of monochrome relief interlace patterns on arches and spandrels of city gates in Mesopotamia. The pattern employed on the Konya portals and the Aleppine mihrabs has been described as the Syrian knot, or the pretzel knot, although the motif rapidly became dispersed across a wider region, the pretzel being particularly visible in this example here. Joachim Gierlitz argues that the decorative and morphological grammar employed in the Byzantine churches in the South Anatolian / North Mesopotamian art region provides a number of the foundations for this visual language that was employed by the designers of the Islamic structures in this region and beyond. An example can be seen in the 13th century Al-Khan gate in Sinjar, although in the Sinjar example there is a dragon and a dragon slayer in each spandrel, and no interlaced semicircle representation of the body of the arch. And this is also the case here in the now lost Bab al-Tilisim, or Talisman Gate, in Baghdad, shown here in one of Gertrude Bell's photographs from the early 20th century before it was blown up. The city of Al-Ahmadiyya is about 160 kilometers northeast of Mosul and was within the domain of Badr ad-Din Lu'lu, who ruled from 1234 to 1259 and to whom the surviving gate is attributed. Although he wasn't ruling till 1234, it is possible the gate was built prior to that date, as he was appointed regent of the region from 1210 onwards, and the Bab al-Mawsul, or the Mosul Gate, in Al-Ahmadiyya is datable to the early 13th century. It features relief monochrome decoration with the overlapping semicircular pattern on the extrados, this is the face of the arch, forming the coiled bodies of two intertwined dragons. In addition, there is a dragon's head and a dragon-slaying human figure wielding a sword in each spandrel. This secular example of a closely related composition illustrates the overt apotropaic and zoomorphic symbolism of the motif that became so much more stylized and non-figural in the context of the religious monuments in Konya and Aleppo. Sarah Kuhn has written the most detailed study of the use and meaning of the dragon in the cultural context of the time, and addresses the multivalent symbolism of the dragon in medieval Islamic art. In addition, in a study of the use of figural reliefs in Anatolia and Iraq for political purposes, Gierlitz takes another approach to possible hidden meanings in monumental architectural decoration of this period, and argues that alongside the apotropaic function and the astrological meaning, such public pictures acted as imperial victory monuments. In Konya and Aleppo, the aniconic rectilinear and curvilinear motifs act as abstracted symbols for the apotropaic depiction of victory over evil, which is so clearly displayed in figural form in the contemporaneous city gate in Al-Ahmadiyya. The overt symbolism of the dragon body appears to have been retained in the examples in Konya, as well as in the ones in Malatya that we'll look at shortly, but in an abstracted form. And it's possible to interpret the spandrel motif as a cipher for the names of Allah, Muhammad, and Ali in the upper corners, in place of the apotropaic dragon slayer figure depicted on several city gates across the region. The spandrel interlace seen on the two portals in Konya thus has the names encoded within it of all three, shown in these rotated drawings of the right-hand spandrel of the Buyut Karate Madrasa portal. This means that the portals in Konya integrate the entirely Islamic names of God, the Rasul, the messenger, and one of the Rashidun, the first four rightly guided caliphs, with the far more ancient protective powers associated with serpent-bodied dragons in an entirely abstract, innovative, and syncretic symbolic composition. We look just at this, the letter Ha in Muhammad, so the H of Muhammad. You can see something not entirely dissimilar inside the, using square Kufic, inside the dome of the Buyut Character Madrasa. So a little later, but very much in the same region and in the building that one of the portals is attached to, in this example in glazed tile, but the similarities can be seen nonetheless. The depiction of dragons was fairly common across Anatolia and beyond in the 13th century. But in the context of the monumental Strapwork decoration on spandrels, the Karate Khan of 638 to 1240 near Kayseri is definitely something of an outlier. It's the only zoomorphic example in the group of Anatolian examples addressed in detail here that fits into the same wider category, and so is worthy of study here. Located on the rear wall of the main entrance portal of the Karate Khan near Kayseri, facing into the courtyard are this pair of dragons with twisted interlaced bodies. They are in the spandrels rather than on the extrados of the arch, as is seen in Aleppo, and there is no dragon slayer figure. The design is an unusual mix of naturalistic heads and highly abstracted bodies. Although it's the only example on the inside rather than the outside of an entrance portal, the same apotropaic meaning should still be assumed. Benoît has studied the dragon slayer motif in detail, with a focus mainly on establishing the full corpus in Anatolia. She notes that the dragon appears to be the opposing force to the good figure slaying it, and that it also had an astrological meaning, representing the invisible eighth planet, Jalzar. Yasotaba has given some more general observations on the symbolic meaning of dragons in medieval Islam, and notes that all architectural examples are on gates or portals. He adds that the intertwined dragons were components of the iconography of power, impregnability, and the good fortune of the structures they form part of, and that the knotting contributed a magical apotropaic symbolism. More recently, Persis Berlekamp has conducted an extensive examination of the possible talismanic and apotropaic qualities attributed to dragons and to lions in an architectural context in medieval Anatolia and Mesopotamia. She argues that dragons had multivalent meanings and could be understood as having frightened away foes, offered protection, as well as acquired increased talismanic efficacy through their paired symmetry. A fragment of a stone frame with a series of low-relief interlinked circles, in a very similar manner to the body of the dragons in the Karate Khan, but smaller, is in the Ingeminare Madrasa Museum, now the Stone Museum of Tashmezes in Konya, but it is fragmentary and its exact origins are unknown. So we can't say a lot about this particular one other than the fact that there were morphics like this. So we know we're dealing with a small fraction of an entire corpus. While the separation of the arch and spandrel decoration can be seen to occur throughout 13th century Anatolia, the use of just the arch to depict apotropaic dragons over an entrance can be found on the doorway into the Aleppo citadel. In this example, datable to the early 13th century, the extrados of the arch has a pair of intertwined dragons in relief, each with a head at either end of its body. The presence of the paired dragon, but no opposing figure slaying them, does indicate that in such cases the dragons were employed as a positive, protective motif. Two clearly related versions of the motif used on the extrados of the arches in Konya and Alamadia were used on both the east and the west portals of the Ulu Jami in Malatya. Not the modern city of Malatya, but Eski Malatya or Old Malatya, also referred to as Battle Ghazi, at 20 or 30 kilometers to the east of the modern city. One is monochrome and somewhat more refined in the quality of its carving, shown here, and the other, which we'll see in a second, is both earlier and somewhat more crude on the west portal, is in a red and grey ablaq. So although ablaq generally means black and white, it can mean other colours, in this case red and black, red and grey. The mosque was founded in 621 to 1224. The west portal was added 24 years later, and then 25 years after that, in 1273-4, this portal was added on, and both bear the name of the same architect, Khusrav, about which we know nothing more than that one name. The east portal, shown here, has been extensively rebuilt recently, but Gertrude Bell's photograph of the portal taken in June 1909 provides evidence that the section we're looking at of the extrados does, while having been cleaned, can be seen to be original. There's evidence of it being original and not a replacement. It is different to both the style of decoration seen on the arch of the west portal and the earlier examples in Konya. Instead of two overlapping semicircular lines, as seen in Konya and another example, the same line doubles back at the base of the semicircle. So it goes along and then doubles back and loops over, round and loops over. And this is the same as is used for the dragon body on the arch extrados of the Mosul Gate in Al-Ahmadiyya, adding credence to the argument that the motif retained its association with the dragon and with the same apotropaic effect, even when shorn of the overtly zoomorphic heads of the two intertwined dragons in the specifically religious context of a mosque portal. The overlapping semicircles of the west portal arch are different again to the ones we just saw, and they're closer in terms of both the pattern and the ablaq effect to the antecedent designs in Konya. The effect in Malatya is achieved by the insertion of these things here, these thin red sections. So it's not true complex stereotomy as seen in Konya. But despite the differences between the two portals, it should be assumed that the same symbolic apotropaic meaning was intended in both cases, with each individual pattern drawing on different antecedent structures in the wider region. Now, some elements of this semiotic apotropaic meaning, especially in the context of an entrance, may be assumed to carry over from the zoomorphic design of the secular structures into the geometric forms on the mosques and madrasas. This apotropaic connection is supported by the otherwise entirely geometric interlace pattern at the Karate Han with the identifiable dragon heads, which makes the largely non-figural pattern become inextricably associated with the twisting, writhing bodies of two apotropaic beasts. In Anatolia, it was primarily the spandrel interlace pattern that continued in use through the 13th century and beyond, rather than this interlaced semicircles on the arch. However, further south, the process seemed to have worked the other way. There are ablaq marble mihrabs in Damascus and Aleppo from the 14th century that feature the same sort of decoration as seen in Konya and earlier structures in Aleppo, but without the interlaced spandrel decoration. So it's the opposite routes taken further south. Subsequently, across the region, the elements of the composition became fragmented and applied individually. Each part of the design tended to become simplified and increasingly stripped of any discernible meaning over time. An almost identical spandrel motif as seen on the two portals in Konya, as well as the two Sultan Han Aksaray niches, but in monochrome relief marble with a simple semicircular profile to the relief molding, was used in the frame of this arch-shaped epigraphic panel bearing the date 642 that was set high up in one of the towers of the city walls of Antalya in southern Turkey. Unlike the earlier examples, there are these cushion voussoirs. They're just called that because they look like cushions, nothing more complex than that, instead of the dragon body interlace on the arch extrados. This panel is now located in the Antalya Museum, and along with the date, it also gives the names and very extensive titles of the Rum Seljuq Sultan Giyath al-Din Khosrow, who ruled from 1237 to 1246. The other main difference in the spandrel design between the ones in Konya and Aleppo is the lack of a central intertwined circle at the apex. So you can see they've now been separated into two elements. Although they contact, they don't have that connecting circle. This Antalya example shows that the two main elements introduced from Aleppo, namely the dragon body interlace on the arch and the strapwork in the spandrels, were soon separated, and in the process, aspects of the overall meaning of the two elements together would have been lost. Despite the geometric interlace motif having been used in the context of the spandrels of several mihrabs, there are only two surviving examples of the use of related motifs on Anatolian mihrabs. These are in the Haji Kilich Jami in Kayseri, dated 647 to 1249, and this one here, the Karate Madrasa in Antalya, built in 648, so dated 1250. The Haji Kilich Jami mihrab features a simpler design with a semicircular profile molding used in the relief pattern. And while the spandrel decoration is similar, the relief interlace pattern on the extrados of the arch of the karate madrasa mihrab is modified. You can see this isn't really a true semicircular motif as we've seen before. It's not related to the pattern in the spandrels, done in a different technique and doesn't connect with them, is incised intaglio and has a different sort of surface treatment. The spandrel pattern, while similar to earlier iterations, here on the right, is noticeably different even to the example added to the nearby Antalya city walls tower just 6 years previously we just saw. As with the diminution of the motif at the Sultan Khan Aksaray, it is not the dominant element of the composition in the Karatai Madrasa mihrab. In addition, the design is not as well conceived as the earlier, larger examples. The interlace is narrower, the carving is shallower, making it less pronounced, and there's a mistake in the execution of the design at the top of the right-hand spandrel in this section here. Following the total defeat of the Rum Seljuqs by the Mongols in the Battle of Kurseda in 1243, there was, unlike so many parts of the Islamic world at this time, especially the eastern part, there was a proliferation in building, despite the dearth, perhaps because, in fact, of this dearth of sultanic patronage. Over the following decades, numerous influential figures vied for political supremacy and visibility through the patronage of religious monuments. Returning to Konya, the portal of the Sahibata Mosque, located a little to the south of the Citadel Mound, features a pair of relevant motifs on the upper section near the base of each of the twin minarets. Only the lower half of the right-hand minaret survives, and the one on the left is lost entirely. In addition, there are other two pairs of relief strapwork motifs in the spandrels of the main arch and the doorway within it. So that's these sections here. These also find their antecedents in the stereotomic marble mihrabs of Zangid and Ayyubid madrasas in Aleppo. The portal is the work of the architect Ablaq ibn Abd Allah and is dated 656, 1258. Along with the two panels with these clear decorative references to the earlier portal on the north wall of the Al-Din Mosque, the Sahibata portal also includes a long excerpt from the same Quranic surah, 148, that is used around the door of the earlier portal. So it's not just these decorative elements that tie them together. It's the same language and text as well as visual things. The upper pair of interlace motifs on the Sahibata portal are similar, but as you can see, not identical. The one on the left has an interlaced circle at the apex of the arch, while the one on the right has no connection between the apex and the upper section of the design. So it's this portion here. In addition, the interlace pattern in the corners, which appears ostensibly the same in both cases, appears to underlap on one side and overlap on the other. These two panels are somewhat oversized in relation to the small windows that they surround and seem more out of proportion and less visually harmonious than the earlier and considerably larger examples. The asymmetric nature of the two panels is quite unusual in Islamic architecture, and it has been suggested by Barbara Brend that this asymmetry is related to the possible Armenian origins of the architect. Alternatively, it may have been a deliberate attempt to highlight the two different square Kufic inscription panels above. That's these sections right here and here. The panel on the base of the minaret on the right features repeats of Abu Bakr, while this one here has repeats of the name Ahli. There are two antecedent Aleppine mihrabs that have spandrel decorations closest to that seen in relief in the corners of the main arch, so these sections here, as well as on a much smaller scale in the spandrels of the two lower Muqama's hood niches, which you can't see, but are just flanking here, and then you also have these motifs here. They're the ones in the Zangid al-Muqaddamiyya madrasa, built in 1168, and the later Ayyubid al-Kamiliyya madrasa, built in 1230 to 37. The former is closest to the shape used on the main arch around the Muqama's hood, this one here, while the latter being somewhat more angular in the manner of the spandrels above the doorway. This desire to refer back to Aleppine antecedents was clearly not something limited to architects working for Rum Seljuq sultans. It's indicative of the syncretic and dynamic approach to architectural ornament, drawing on a wide range of sources and integrating them in new and innovative ways that was underway in the Konya region throughout the 13th century. Over the course of the century, it can be seen that the application of the pattern shifts from flat or very low relief ablaq marble to somewhat higher relief stone and a single color, and in the case of the Sahibata mosque portal, the addition of a background of these small sections of turquoise glazed tiles. The final stage of development of the interlace pattern was the division of the previously interconnected spandrel motifs into two separate patterns. This can be seen with these relief sections either side of the two vertical bands of text on the upper section of the portal of the Injil-Minarelli madrasa in Konya. The building does not have a foundation inscription giving a date, but is presumed to have been built after the Sahibata mosque portal of 1258. It's been argued for a date in the 1260s, and an endowment charter, a waqfiyya, associated with the building bears the date 663, so 1264, which would make that the terminus antiquem for the building. It's the same work of the same architect as the Sahibata mosque, Kalok ibn Abdallah, with his signature placed in two roundels above these two interlaced motifs, and you can see the Ibn Abdallah section here. These two pieces are the only examples of monumental rectilinear geometric relief decoration seen on the whole portal. They give it a distinctive aesthetic amidst the wide array of different types of ornament, much of which is clearly drawn from the same well as the decoration seen on the earlier Mengecekid mosque and hospital complex built in Divri in 626 or 1229. And Divri is it's a World Heritage Site now, and it's just a little bit to the east of Sivas in central Turkey. The two examples in the Injil-Minarelli madrasa portal are the last monumental use of a motif clearly linked to, but much altered from, the flat marble examples built in the same city just 40 years or so before. They highlight the rapid rise and then fall of such a distinctive and recognizable motif in the architecture of Konya in the 13th century. While the pair of related motifs on the Sahibata mosque portal are similar, they each retain a sense of completeness. In contrast, the ones on the Injil-Minarelli madrasa mark the only instance of the two corner elements being separated and being applied either side of a different type of central ornament. As the 13th century progressed, the related arch and spandrel motif appears to have moved away from their overtly Ayyubid Aleppine roots and become integrated into the relief carved stonework aesthetic of the indigenous Anatolian architectural tradition. The two soon became separated, and in addition, as in the case of the Injil-Minarelli madrasa portal, the two corner elements that had previously been interlinked are separated. A very close copy of the spandrel pattern of the two earlier portals in Konya forms part of the Mamluk Kalaun complex facade in Cairo, built in 683, 1284 to 5. But here, instead of the semicircular interlace on the face of the arch, there are alternating black and white joggled voussoirs, closer perhaps to what we saw at the Sultan Khan. There is also a slightly later, more complex, closely related variant of this spandrel motif nearby on the portal of the Khan al-Khalili Bazaar, built under the rule of Kaytbay, who ruled from 1468 to 96. So it continued on across the centuries in the Mamluk domain. There was a degree of longevity in the use of the main element of the spandrel motif that had been introduced from Aleppo into this architecture of Konya in the early 13th century. One small-scale example is in the corners of the inscription panel, dated 812, so 1406 to 1410, over the door of the Sayyid Mahmud Hairani tomb in Akshahir, to the west of Konya. However, while this example shows the form had truly entered the decorative vocabulary of the region, the monumentality has been completely lost, and its diminutive scale, you can see here just how small this panel is. This is not much taller than your average person, might even be about 2 meters high. So the panel itself is less than a meter high. This diminutive scale is a far cry from the earlier, larger, and much more sophisticated examples. The last monumental use of a somewhat related pattern, in ablaq, but quite different in design, consisting of thin slabs of applied marble rather than true stereotomic decoration, can be seen on the portal of the Isa Bey Mosque in Ephesus, built in 1378 by another architect from Damascus. Also, its use under the Karamanids, who ruled 1256 to 1475, as well as with the earlier post-Qasidag use in the Sahibato Mosque and the Inja Minarelli Madrasa portals, shows that it was not a symbol that was necessarily associated specifically with the Rum Seljuq dynasty. There may have been an attempt by some patrons to connect themselves with the Rum Seljuq dynasty in the minds of the public, who may have viewed the building, but such a hypothesis is practically impossible to prove. After it was first introduced to the region from the south, it was initially only used on monuments patronized by the Rum Seljuq sultans, and despite its wider use in the following centuries, is now generally used in most modern Turkish publications and signage as being synonymous with the Rum Seljuq dynasty. As you can see here, there was a brief revival in the late 19th century, as at least 2 variants of this motif that had no prior Ottoman connections were employed on municipal buildings across Anatolia. These 2 here, a library on the left and a middle school on the right in Aksaray, are typical examples of this brief resurgence at the tail end of the period of Ottoman rule, but on entirely secular rather than religious buildings. Despite its striking aesthetic and the use of stereotomic ablaq marble strapwork, it never really became embedded into the architectural traditions of Anatolia in the way that it had in Syria. Apart from the first 3 examples, the Al-Adin Mosque North Portal, the Karate Madrasa Portal, and the Sultan Khan Aksaray, it was the motif rather than the technique that was adopted by the architects and stonemasons working in the region. The various constituent elements of the pattern had been developed by the marble carvers of Aleppo in the late 12th century, were used as a source of innovation and adaptation in the context of relief carved limestone in the following decades, especially in and around Konya. In the first 2 iterations in Konya, a distinctive style was created, but with these successive innovations and alterations, the underlying meaning of the whole composition was soon lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That was really fascinating, and what a wonderful tour of these buildings, and some of them sadly lost as well. So it was really special to see those images. So thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there are some questions. I know that I've seen one already in the Q&A box. This came in quite early. This is from Fabian Strath, who would like to know, he's very interested in Seljuk Byzantine material engagements and entanglements. And I think he's also quite interested in spolia and kind of reuse and that kind of thing. But he says, can we also find the direct adoption of certain motifs or ornaments newly carved into the monuments?
There is a lot of Byzantine spolia used very overtly, usually from the ambos or the pulpit, or from the low panels separating the congregation from the priest, and used very conspicuously. So not just accident of, oh, there's a bit of marble, that's nice. You know, they've got one of these pieces used right over the entrance of the imperial tomb in Konya. So very conscious use of Byzantine and things connected with Byzantine motifs. But the short answer, as far as I can think, is no, not really. They don't tend to copy much from the Byzantine tradition, and at least not directly. So you can see these clear links with earlier Byzantine floors, but they're putting it on buildings, facades, not on the floor. They're not doing it in tesserae, sort of marble pieces. They're using much larger blocks. So there's drawing on that tradition, very much part of the world that they're emerging in and that they're developing in, but no conscious use, not of the kind that when you see something like the Cordoba Mosque, where they copy classical columns or simplified versions of classical columns when they do an extension rather than doing it completely different. So short answer, no, but there's always exceptions to prove the rule, I'm sure.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive answer. Good. We've got a couple more. One from Shirin Sanasan, who says, does the Seljuks' interlace motifs develop from shamanism's dragon motif? Does it always mean that the interlace, hold on a second, these are 3 questions. Maybe I'll ask you one at a time. Yeah. So yes, the connection with shamanism, with the dragon motif, I think is the first one.
I mean, the shamanism in terms of the Central Asian links, possibly. There's been such a long history of the use of knotting dragons as apotropaic symbols in the region for, I mean, thousands of years before the Muslims arrive and start building these. But a lot of these the Muslim Turks, they're relatively recent converts to Islam. They've come from, in the most part, the Seljuks' origins are in Central Asia. So there's sort of an element of muscle memory, longue durée connections to images and symbols. So yes, there probably is an element of that. These things are, I hate these sort of buzzwords like polyvalent, but essentially they are. There's multiple meanings, both multiple meanings to different viewers, but also multiple sources for similar things. So I think there is an element of that, but I don't think you'd ever want to say that's the only source for it. Really.
No, sure. I definitely read something quite recently about dragon stones in Armenia. So these kind of objects which are still kind of still in the landscape, which certainly form part of how people kind of operate in that landscape. But there's more from that question. It's said it's been answered, but it hasn't. Hold on a second. Also asking, does it always mean that the interlaced motifs, in the Kufic read Allah, Muhammad, and Ali, do all those 3 names always occur in that little motif in the corner?
Not always. I mean, this is the first publication that's sort of making the claim that they're there, although it's not entirely down to me. As I say, it was a conversation with Scott Redford talking about this sort of possibility of Allah being in there, and then you can try and find these different elements in there. So it's not that it's forced, but it's not entirely clear, and it's certainly not something that is widely accepted. So I think you could look at the context. The argument here is that they're specifically replacing something. So when you've got the dragon body for the apotropaic, and you're taking it from an area where previously they had the dragon slayer, the victor, the power for good, and it's being replaced with an overtly Muslim linking together of these 3 sort of core figures. So that's the rationale for it in that particular context. I think once they do start to be taken down to the level of just motifs, like we saw in that last example, or the last one in action here, there I think it becomes more problematic to claim that it is. I mean, possibly it's still encoded within it and viewed that way, but I think there is an element of it being reduced to a motif from a symbol. So I think it's something that has it there when you've got all the constituent parts, but once you break it apart and once it's separated from that dragon body, then it becomes less likely, and especially when it's used sort of more generically, like just on random objects. But it's not impossible, but I think it's more of a stretch to claim that.
Yeah, it's interesting though, isn't it, to think about the kind of, I like that term, muscle memory, to think about the fact that it's almost, it may be an apotropaic act to put that in there because it relates to something that did once mean that those names were there. So it could be something that's also part of the kind of the creator's kind of apotropaism, as it were. But there's more for this question from Shirin. Also asking, does Ali's name relate to the Sufi concept in the Seljuk period?
Possibly not. I mean, the Sunni Shia divide is not so rigid at that point. A lot of the conversion of Muslims was through non-conventional, non-sort of imperial sort of Sunni Orthodox means. So there were a lot of unconventional Muslim figures moving around, a lot of which were Sufis. So there's an element of that within it, but you have to look at the context that this is being built by sultans, for sultans in their major imperial foundation. So if you were finding it on some little Sufi Khanqa out in the middle of nowhere, or on a very sort of rudimentary manuscript, that's very different from something that is very much bearing the name of the Sultan in the most sort of expensive building material in the center of the city. So I think it is a much more orthodox usage of it in this particular context.
Yeah. Okay. There's so many questions for you, Richard. I'll try and get them.
I've got water.
You've got some water. That's good. We've got a question from Sultana Al-Kayiti, who says, please could you extrapolate further on the talismanic meaning of the dragon motif on portals and doors and their symbolism in Seljuk architecture? Are there any suggestion of Zoroastrian influences? Why do you think the dragon was chosen to denote power, impregnability, rather than the lion?
I mean, the lion is used a lot as well, so that they are both used, but the lion doesn't tend to feature on the city gates as much. The lion is more often used as a cipher, I mean, either directly for Ali or for the ruler himself, with that sort of connotation there. So the lion in many ways is a less enigmatic motif. You kind of know where you stand with it. If there's a lion there, ruler, power, majesty, king, done, move along. The dragon is more problematic because in different contexts, it can be evil or it can be good. So it can be the force of evil being slayed by the force for good, the dragon slayer, or it can be there as a protective symbol. So it's used in very different ways in different contexts. And I won't claim to have any sort of absolute knowledge on that, because I think there's so much you need to know about the intention and interpretation. Well, the intention of the person who put it there and the interpretation of the very different viewers. Most of the population were Christian. Are they going to interpret it the same way as the minority Muslim population? Do they see it as an imposition of a sort of invading, occupying force or a resisting force? I mean, there's so many questions that it becomes impossible to have one clear or even two clear answers that say it's binary, this or that, good or bad, because clearly on its own, you wouldn't think it's bad. When it's there with someone killing it, it can't be that good, or it would be being depicted being murdered. So, it is a complex issue that on the one level, it would ever get a clear answer, but I think we can keep interrogating the evidence as well as the physical material evidence, as well as what sources there are to try and get a sense on. And it has to be case specific as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. This kind of idea that there is just one or even just two answers to what the meaning of a symbol is quite patently ridiculous. So yeah, no, I appreciate that. Good. Okay, let's move on. We've got a question from Alessandro Camis, who says, as the ablaq is a structural element, shouldn't it be considered as such, where the decoration aspect has a secondary role? And then he mentions a paper to link to, which I can send through to you afterwards.
That'd be
read it.
I mean, in terms of, it's not always a structural element, it's a chromatic definition, it's black and white, so it generally is built into a structure, but you can have an ablaq veneer over a building. So it can be used structurally, and its origins perhaps might be seen in the sort of opus mixtum of Byzantine and Roman architecture, where you have bands in one color that are stone and another in brick, and that has structural benefits in terms of the ability for the brick to move and absorb earthquakes, so that that has structural imperatives. But when you move away from that, and it's literally just courses of stone, and some are black and some are white, then there's less of a case for that having a structural element. and then even more so removed from that when it is motifs. You know, it is just the veneer, like we saw in Malatia, where you have red sections, thin, maybe 1 centimeter thick inserts to give that ablaq or bichrome effect. But you can take them out and the structure cares not a whit. It will still stand up.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. Good. So yeah, I think we've answered that one. That's been done. No, that's done. Someone says, Seljuq Polat says, I've read that the Seljuks put the hooves on their horses the wrong way round so that the enemies couldn't find them. Is that correct?
I don't
know the answer to that one.
Yeah, I don't know.
Question. No, okay, fine. No answers for that one.
I would be pure realm of even more speculation than most art historians indulge into that.
Excellent. Very good. Valentine asks, did this type of strapwork or variations of it spill over into the Christian architecture of Georgia and Armenia? So thinking about the way it proliferated into other parts of the world as well.
There are a lot of very close links between the architecture in Anatolia that was being built for Muslim patrons and for Armenian and Georgian patrons. I'm trying to think of any. I can't think of any instances of this specific type of strapwork, but there's a lot of muqarnas being used on the gavit, or the sort of narthex of Armenian churches, and in recesses that look very much, you know, if you didn't know it was a church, you'd think it was a mihrab, but it's actually just a niche with an altar in it. And a lot of the vegetal, what used to be called arabesque motif, so a geometric and vegetal strapwork decoration, but not of this specific type, so more generic, just covering bands, covering areas. So a lot of close connections, which is not surprising because in most cases I think it's the same people building it. It's just that they're commissioned to build one building or another with specialists doing the language element. But they're being built at the same time under the same rulers for different religious distinctions. So there are close links on a lot of levels, and a lot of people have been working on this. I know Yves Porter has done something recently, Anthony Eastman has, I've written a few things, but I'm not aware of any direct links. But if anyone has examples, I haven't spent nearly enough time looking at all the Armenian materials. So I'm all ears if you find some, I'd love to.
I'll pass those on. Let's have a little look. What's the next one? Luai Al-Hussein says, I would like to ask if there is any possible correlation between the form and the occupation of some of the motifs with the function of the buildings that they were found on. So thinking about the relationship between what the building does and those particular motifs.
I mean, generally the ones with some form of zoomorphic, like overtly zoomorphic or figural element, are being used as either city gates, primarily city gates. So the whole point is that they're the portal in, they're that point of security, both in terms of security for the individual from the sort of the dangerous outside to the protection of the city, but also protecting the city. That's the point at which people either come in or don't come in, depending upon your whim. So they're clearly apotropaic in that sense, is that you want to protect something, and it's a point of transition. And there's historically, long before Prophet Muhammad stepped foot on this earth, there was this connection of portals being this sort of transition, and any religious space is going from the sacred to the profane, in and out, but they tend to only be used on some sort of gateway. So whether it's going into a mosque and non-figural, or whether it's going into a city gate and is comfortable with having figural decoration, they tend to only be used on gateways. So that in a way they're always serving the same basic function of protecting the building and the people going in and out of it by extension.
Okay, thank you. Great. Okay, so we've got a question about the network of craftsmen or craftspeople. Amur asks, do you think that the masons and artists and craftsmen had a collaboration, since all the examples are quite close in date? was there some kind of a contact between them, some kind of network of tradesmen, do you think?
I mean, we don't know anything like as much as we do for the medieval European trade guilds. We don't have, never mind the actual records of them, we don't even really clearly understand how some of these guilds, if indeed that's what they were, worked, how people were able to move around. We know there was a lot of mobility. So there's someone coming from the very far east of Iran, from Tus, signing things in Anatolia in the 13th century. So we know there's a huge mobility of people. And as people move through the landscape, they're going to see things. So there's that one obvious element of just visual experience. There's people building something in one place and then building the same or similar things elsewhere for a different client. There's certain issues in terms of the ability to work. So hard stone masons working with marble is a very specific skill. Anyone who can carve wood can probably carve stucco, and at a push could probably carve some sort of limestone or sandstone, because when they're freshly quarried, they're actually surprisingly soft. They harden out as the moisture leaves them. But marble is hard to work, and it is one of the reasons why it's mostly marble spolia that's used, because the work's already done. You need to cut it off to length, fill it, trim it, that's doable. But cutting new decoration into marble is a very specialist skill. So that's not something that is as easy to exchange. But you can see something in marble and go, well, I'll like to make that, but I'm not going to make it in marble, so I'm going to carve the pattern in rather than cut pieces of marble to fit. So there is that element of people are always, there's a very innovative dynamic period. So you're seeing a lot of new things, old things combined in different ways. It's sort of the first wave of postmodernism. They're taking classical motifs, but using them in a non-classical ordered way. They're trying things that were developed in Iran in brick, but building them in stone, and some don't work and some do. There's an air of experimentation. So people are trying new things. They want to have the latest. They want to show off that they're able to do the best, most up-to-date things, as is human nature.
Yeah, I guess so. It sounds to me like there might be an excellent PhD project in there for someone to think about the different material connections and whether or not there are, there's network analysis or something that could be done. Not that network analysis is the be all and end all.
It's very useful though. It's a useful tool.
It is, and it could be for thinking about this kind of connection.
Especially in lieu of any actual primary or virtually no primary written sources. Very few manuals that you have to use. So you've got to try different tools in the toolbox.
Absolutely. Well, get in touch, people. I don't know if you're taking PhD students.
I am, yes.
Perfect.
Come along. York's a lovely city.
Actually related, Richard Hughes asked, possibly I missed it as unfortunately a little late. It seems to be a tradition carving in stone. Does it at all appear carved in wood and also penned on paper? So we've kind of half touched on that already, I think.
It's not really that common to find. I'm not a manuscript expert. There probably are some examples in manuscripts. Taylor Jackson's just come out with a brilliant new book on manuscripts of this period in Anatolia with Edinburgh University Press, which I'm awaiting a copy patiently. It's on its way. So that may have something in terms of its use in manuscript. I have looked at quite a lot of the woodwork from the period, and it tends to be other motifs. There's sort of vegetal swirling motifs, geometric borders, but not so much this sort of very specific strapwork interlace. It does seem to be something that is developed in a monumental architectural context and seems to remain in it, even though that tiny stone panel in Akshire here could just as easily be done in wood, but I'm not aware of any. But again, there's a lot more out there than any one person tends to be able to see. So I'd love to see any if anyone knows of any.
Right, that's your task, Richard. There's a couple more to go. Mina Özkar asks, she said, thank you so much, Richard, for a refreshing perspective to the stone strapwork. In one of the examples from Konya, you pointed out a few peculiarities, mistakes or miscalculations, if you will, in the making. What was the reason for this clumsiness or lack of skill in the 13th century? Or were these bad restorations from later periods? Can we date the stone inlays? Do you have evidence enough to elaborate this level of skill?
Yes, I think if you're referring to the one to the right of the Konya mosque portal, I was looking at it when I was there not that long ago, and I couldn't really tell. It is weird that it's just a bit too small. It does seem so off as to be, it's an odd mistake, unless they carved what was the middle line of that strapwork and started to chip away and realized, oh no, that's not the top, that's the that's the middle of it, and just went with it. My gut is generally to blame it on poor restorations later. That may not be fair, but given the general quality of the work and the rest of the composition and the crispness of the carving and the inlay and the inscriptions and everything, I would think it's more likely that it's an issue of restoration. But even that doesn't make a lot of sense, because the restorers, that they have their faults, but it's sort of so far off. But yes, I would suspect it's a restoration issue, not an original mistake. But then there is that one in Antalya in the mihrab, and once you've got a large block, especially as most of these surface details will be carved in situ, once you've got it in situ and large amounts of decoration around it, you've kind of backed yourself into a corner, unless there's unlimited money and a particularly finicky patron. It might just be you have to go with it and kind of hope nobody's quite so obsessive with detail for at least another 800 years.
I mean, we've got to also remember imperfections are what makes things truly beautiful. After all, we know this. Okay, so there are just a couple more points and questions. Isabel Miller says, if the lion is the sun, could the dragon be the moon? Hence its duality.
Yeah, I mean, there is this connection with this mystical sort of non-visible planet, which is getting into the realms of a form of Islamic science that is so far beyond my understanding. Willie Hart, I think it was, did an article, voluminous, I think this is a 60 or 70 page article in the 1930s, which no one has had either the sense or the stupidity to try and better ever since. So that remains the last word on the subject. And he said that the dragon is associated with this planet. I don't think so much with the moon, although there's no reason not to. I'm just thinking of the portal of the big hospital in Sivas, the Darüşşafaka in Sivas, which was built in just before 1220, and that has suns and moons on it and lions on the portal. No dragon reference whatsoever. It's a pair of lions on the portal, and then you go through the portal and there's a sun and a moon on either spandrel of the main eastern one. So that there is definitely use of lunar references. And of course, Akmar is there's a famous mosque in Cairo, Al-Akmar, the moonlit mosque. So there's a lot of references to moon, but I'm not aware of it having a link to dragons.
Okay. Actually, Nish on this topic, Nish left me with a question. She was interested in thinking about whether or not some of these architectural symbols are representative of political factions at the end of the 13th century, and whether they can be, is it at all possible to start to say this belongs to this person or this person, and they adopt different or particular motifs just for themselves or anything?
Oh, like a sort of herald, almost like a herald sort of motif, or like the Byzantine, the red and the green.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
I'm not aware. I mean, there were no shortage of political rivalries and falling out, but because more so than symbolism, Islamic architecture is a tradition of buildings that speak, they'll tend to say it. They use script much more heavily than other traditions. So it generally is allied around individuals or an individual, and they will be very conscious to put their name, and they'll put their title. And often the title is clearly nonsense. So I'm the ruler of the land and the two seas, and then sort of 20 miles away, there's an actual real sultan going, I don't think so, mate. I own everything. but I'll let you away with that. So they do tend to be much more overtly literate in these sort of political claims for jurisdiction, legitimacy, whether they're the person who should be ruling or, making, and often they'll chip other people's names off and carve their name in. So there is this
Roman
use of script and replacing, even just eviscerating sections. But less, I can't think of an example of where they're using these symbols. There's the double-headed eagle is used a lot as a clearly imperial symbol, which again goes right back to the Byzantines and long before. So they are using things like that, but they're very clearly well-established ones where it's quite clearly a sultanic symbol.
Yeah, okay. On the legibility of things, because there was one. I mean, I really loved the Kufic interpretation of those corner pieces. I thought that was really interesting and kind of an innovative to think like that. And then there was the very small inscription on a ceiling. And is there a space for that to be legible to humans, or is this legible to divinity? Or again, are we dealing with something that is just the word itself is the apotropeism, and it's not legibility at all?
No, I mean, in terms of those glazed ones in that dome, it's not so high up or so vast. You can read it. It is legible.
Okay.
It's abstracted and it's not dotted, but they don't have long inscriptions in that sort of context. There's much earlier examples of Kufic being used extensively, but where literate meaning specific legal text is required, they will tend to use a cursive dotted script that is very clear to read. It's unambiguous. The same often with Quranic inscriptions. It's the more generic names and titles which really they're an aid memoir rather than anything else. So it's just sort of it's using them in a way, it's using them apotropeically, but it's just sort of covering it there that anyone who sort of is in that world and literate will immediately recognize. Same with sort of, you can put a few sections of a Quranic passage on, and people are, well, did they run out of space? They don't need to put the whole thing. It brings it to mind for a Hafiz who knows it all anyway. It's not instruction, it's reminding them.
Oh, it's lovely. It's really interesting. Okay, we're running out of time. I have got one more question here from Musna Al-Kaiti, who is asking if there are any updates on reconstruction in Aleppo.
Yes, I must admit I'm not totally up to date on it, but I know there is a lot of government money going into reconstruction. It's sort of been made a sort of cause célèbre for the government. Especially, it's obviously highlighted on the big sort of high-profile buildings. So the minaret of the mosque in particular, they've got all the pieces put together. They've got a plan for it. Luckily, the whole thing was photogrammetrically scanned, and there's a full digital model of it. So they are rebuilding that as we speak. The covered bazaar is being rebuilt because that's sort of central to the trade of the city centre. Beyond that, probably fairly limited. It certainly won't be, like Dresden or something in the war where every building was pretty much put back as it was, or large numbers of them were. But it is coming on a pace. I can't speak to the level of authenticity. Quite often expediency is that you build the structure in reinforced steel and concrete, and then you clad it with either something that looked original or some elements of the original building. That has its own problems, but when you've got no clean water or infrastructure and people starving to death, I don't think we can really condemn people for making decisions that compromise.
Of course.
It is coming along, that there is development going on.
Okay. Well, Richard, I think that's it. There is one comment to Fabian Stroth, if Fabian is still here, from Asnu Yalcin, who says, there are Seljuk copies, example of Byzantine capitals in Konya next to Byzantine spolia capitals. Fabian, there you are. That's for you.
In fact, that portal that I was talking about, that might be the one they mean, that one of the columns is antique and the other is a direct copy. But that was just because they wanted symmetry. But yes, that is an example of imitation. It's not identical, but it's really close. The main way you can tell is that one is a single piece, column and capital, and the other's a capital and a column joined together.
Gotcha. Great. I think this has been an absolutely fascinating talk, Richard. Thank you so much.
Thanks for everyone coming. Hope you found it interesting. I enjoyed doing it.
There's the comments in the chat are just, there people have been really, really thrilled by today's talk, and obviously there's been lots and lots of questions. Oh, there's one more. We've got 3 minutes before we're kind of
sure. Yeah.
This is from Drake Wolf in South Africa, who says, among the various materials mentioned employed in the portals, have there been any attempts recorded in tile or glass at any point?
The only examples for tile are those ones on the Sahibata portal where the background is monochrome turquoise. The 13th century is really when tile starts to come into the ascendancy in Anatolia, but it is generally used either internally, like that dome that I showed the section of, or on walls inside, like in a courtyard. So that there's several madrasas. In fact, the Malatya Mosque has a lot of tile work inside it, but they didn't tend to use it outside. It's really a little bit later and further to the east where it becomes ubiquitous externally. So first under the Timurids, and then the Safavids, and the sort of high thing, whole buildings covered in it. And subsequently in Anatolia, you see external use of tile with the Ottomans. But even then, they primarily use it inside. It's more of an internal decoration than an external. It tends to remain an Olithic stone aesthetic for the most part externally, even though there's incredible rich use of it inside buildings and sort of around courtyards and things. But not really much use of it externally, and certainly not in this context. I say the only ones I can think of off the top of my head are the Sahibata ones.
No, I mean, it is quite different in Iran and Central Asia, isn't it? Where it is much more kind of external. But no, not time to chat about, travels in Central Asia at the moment. Thank you everyone for coming. I hope that we've all we've managed to answer all your questions. Richard, thank you very much indeed for your talk. That was fascinating and incredibly well delivered, and clearly has stimulated a lot of conversation. So we look forward to hearing more in due course.
Well, thank you, Anna and Nisha, and to everyone for coming along. It's been nice to give it, and for those who are interested, there's endless more details in the next issue of Anatolian Studies.
Just wait for it to land on your doorstep. That's what we want. But yes, I mean, as Nisha was saying at the beginning, this is supposed to be a community. So if people want to get in touch and have more discussion with Richard, then we can help that.
If anyone wants to get in touch, it's richard.mcclary@york.ac.uk. Drop me an email and we can have a chat or exchange messages, whatever you want. Always happy to talk to people who are odd enough to be interested in this stuff as much as I am.
It's not odd, it's wonderful. Richard, thank you. That's generous of you to share with us. That's wonderful.